Number 5. Chernobyl. I've made the executive decision to kick off today with the most obvious location. For those who might not be aware of the horrors of Chernobyl, allow me to start today off with a mini sad history lesson. So the disaster was a nuclear accident that occurred on the 26th of April of 1986 at the number 4 reactor in the Chernobyl nuclear power plant near the city of Pripyat. It is one of only 2 nuclear energy accidents rated at 7, which is the maximum severity on the International Nuclear Event Scale, the other being the 2011 Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan. The meltdown and explosions ruptured the reactor core and destroyed the reactor building. So this was immediately followed by an open-air reactor core fire, which lasted until May 4th of 1986, during which airborne radioactive contaminants were released and deposited onto other parts of the USSR and Europe. Approximately 70% landed in Belarus, around 16 kilometers away. The fire released about the same amount of radioactive material as the initial explosion. In response to the initial accident, a 10-kilometer radius exclusion zone was created 36 hours after the accident, from which approximately 49,000 people were evacuated, primarily from Pripyat. The exclusion zone was later increased to a radius of 30 kilometers, from which an additional 68,000 people were evacuated. Following the disaster, Pripyat was abandoned and eventually replaced by the new purpose-built city of Slavutych. In July of 2019, the Ukrainian president announced that the Chernobyl site would become an official tourist attraction. Immunology experts recommend that tourists wear clothes and shoes they are comfortable with throwing away, avoid plant life, especially the depths of the forest due to the high levels of radiation. Oh, why? Oh, just because the areas were not cleaned in the aftermath of the disaster and remain highly contaminated. Research showed that fungus, moss, and mushrooms are radioactive. So among the buildings that were abandoned were multiple schools, with the small city having 15 preschools for just under 5,000 attendees. Most of the buildings in the city are practically empty, but not the schools. School books and class magazines were clearly of no value to looters, and city residents were more worried about saving at least something from their personal property, leaving the buildings almost intact, minus the effects of being left empty over time. Moving on to other places of note, the Pripyat amusement park was set to have its grand opening on the 1st of May in 1986, in time for the May Day celebrations, but those plans were cancelled on April 26. Several sources report that the park was opened for a short time on the 27th before the announcement to evacuate the city was made to distract the residents from the unfolding disaster nearby. Constructed under the Soviet Union as a park of culture and rest, typical of many large cities in the then Soviet Union, the amusement park's attraction were manufactured by the firm Attraction, who were responsible for the construction of many of the amusement parks which remain to be seen around the former Soviet Union today in various states of repair. Located northwest to the Palace of Culture in the center of Pripyat, the park had 5 attractions: the iconic 26-meter Ferris wheel titled Circular Overview, the Autodrome bumper cars, a paratrooper ride called Chamomile, Russian swing boats, and also a carnival shooting game. Fun fact, the successor to the original company is still manufacturing the Ferris wheel, paratrooper, and bumper cars with a similar design as of 2017. Radiation levels around the park vary. The liquidators washed radiation into the soil after the helicopters carrying radioactive materials used the grounds as a landing strip, so concrete areas are less radioactive. However, areas where moss is built up can emit levels amongst the highest levels of radiation in the whole area. So the Ferris wheel actually made news in September of 2017 when Polish tourists turned it mechanically for the first time since 1986, later returning it to its original position. As much as it would be fascinating to explore history, I'll wait till it's a little less detrimental to my health. Number 4, the Paris catacombs. Deep underground the city of Paris are hundreds of miles of tunnels in a complex network that is one of the oldest in the world. It's a darker city that few tourists experience due to the high risk of danger. You know, people often get lost. The walls can also collapse at any moment, so many who venture there wear miner's helmets. There's no electricity amongst the endless winding canals, corridors, and crypts filled with mounds of unidentified skulls, which are estimated to be about 6 million deceased Parisians. There are parts so tight that you have to lie on your belly and slither forward like a worm to get through. Only a small section of the catacombs is accessible to tourists, while the rest has been illegal to enter since 1955. Look, I'm not saying you shouldn't explore the tourist accessible areas. Heck, I want to visit those myself, but stay out of the illegal areas. Urban explorers who frequent the catacombs call themselves cataphiles, which I must admit is a very smart moniker. They paint, sculpt, and create other art, while also building false walls, trap doors, and secret chutes to keep away the cataflicks or catacops who try to catch them trespassing. You must know a cataphile who can be your guide to even try to explore the unknown, or else risk getting lost or stuck for who knows how long. As much as I love exploring creepy history, the thought of getting lost in such a cursed place is a type of scared I'm not fond of, and don't particularly ever want to experience.
In at number 3 we have Jazirat Al Hamra, which is best known as the ghost town of the United Arab Emirates, is said to be the country's most haunted place, remaining a number of spooky events experienced by the locals and curious visitors. Jazirat Al Hamra is an abandoned village located to the south of the city of Ras Al Khaimah, one of the 7 emirates that form the UAE. The coastal territory is the region's best example of a pre-oil village, displaying 3 distinct types of early and mid-20th century Gulf architecture. The town of Ras Al Khaimah is the crumbling remains of a once thriving fishing village. The name translates to Red Island for the red and bronze colour of the sand on which the town was built. The former tidal island was predominantly home to the Zab tribe, who by 1831 developed the area into a renowned pearling trade centre, was home to over 4,000 inhabitants and dozens of fishing and trading ships, and with its good fortune came expansion that continued well into the start of the 20th century. But by 1968, Al Jazirat Al Hamra became nothing more than an abandoned town, due to a clash between the tribe and Sheikh Saka bin Mohammed of Ras Al Khaimah due to some unclear reasons. Thus most of them migrated to Abu Dhabi. The village consisted of 334 buildings, including 18 shops and 11 mosques, and is nearly unchanged since its people left in 1968. Al Jazirat Al Hamra, now filled-in patch of land in the south of Ras Al Khaimah, remained abandoned and untouched. However, rumor has it that this extraordinary quiet and silent village is extremely haunted by the jinns. People even gossip that they can hear the strange noise and disembodied voices near the beach of this ghost village. Many visitors also assert that they felt uneasy, like danger was lurking, waiting for them when they pressed on further into the haunted village. Some of them even claimed to have reported seeing unexplainable handprints on the ruined pillars and walls, and experienced many more paranormal things within this haunted ghost town. In at number 2 we have Pyramid in Norway. Some say that the Soviet town of Pyramid in Norway was abandoned overnight, and for a good reason. Located in Svalbard, an archipelago situated between Norway and the North Pole, Pyramiden can be reached by boat from about mid-May until the beginning of October, when waters bordering the town are free from sea ice. Established in the 17th century, the town was used as a base for whaling and walrus trapping. Though at the start of the 20th century the culture shifted to coal mining. At first Pyramiden was a sleepy place with hardly any residents at all, but after World War II the Soviets allocated more money to the town. They constructed dozens of new buildings, including a hospital, a recreation centre called the Cultural Palace, and a large cafeteria. In the 1980s the town's population reached its peak of more than 1,000 people, but not long due to the wake of the Soviet Union's dissolution the town would be left completely abandoned. As when the Soviet Union fell apart, mining stopped in Pyramiden and the miners had to leave. On March 31st, 1998, the last coal was extracted from the mine, and the approximately 300 workers who still lived there began shipping out. The residents never returned, and today the town still stands much as it was when the last men departed. And finally, in at number 1 we have Batstow Village, New Jersey. There are around 28 known ghost towns in New Jersey, but this one has to be the most terrifying. Founded in 1766, the Batstow Village was built primarily to accommodate once prosperous ironworks. At the time, the site possessed 3 valuable resources: water for mills, abundant wood for charcoal, and naturally occurring bog iron. During the Revolutionary War, Batstow supplied the Continental Army with iron, while its remoteness protected it from British attack. In 1784, Batstow was bought by William Richard, whose family owned and operated the ironworks for 92 years. Following the discovery of coal and ore in Pennsylvania, in the 1840s the iron industry began to dwindle in the Batstow village. Nervous they were going to run out of business, the Richards family exploited another abundant local resource, sand, to make glass. But in 1874 a house fire spread and destroyed the glass making facilities, remaining furnaces, and 17 houses that were in the town. Due to the destruction of the glass facilities, the town of Batstow and the Richards family fell into bankruptcy. The Richards and many of the villagers moved away after the accident, leaving the site silent. In 1876 the property, along with huge tracts of land around it, was purchased by industrialist and businessman Joseph Wharton, with the plan of reinventing the declining town into an agricultural, foresting and cranberry farm. But after his death in 1909, the land was held by a trust until purchased by the state in 1954 to form the Wharton State Forest. The state's plan for the town was to restore its 50-room mansion, as well as to rebuild the dam that was located on the lake, though the efforts to reinvent Batstow weren't enough to save it from its inevitable end. As when the state of New Jersey bought the village with a plan of improving it, the residents didn't see a future in the town, so they all left it, with roots that can be traced back to 1766 and the last remaining resident leaving in 1989. There are more than 40 structures still standing in the historic town, including a charcoal kiln, carriage houses, stables, ice and milk houses, a blacksmith, general store, gristmill, and a wheelwright shop, though they are all left untouched since the last residents left in 1989.
Number 5, the Mary Celeste. Probably Probably the most famous mystery ship on our list today is the Mary Celeste, a merchant brigantine that was found drifting in December of 1872 off of the Azores with her crew of 10 nowhere to be found. The Canadian brigantine De Gratia found her in a disheveled but seaworthy condition under partial sail and with her lifeboat missing. There were also signs that something had gone wrong. To be specific, one of its pumps was dismantled, but once again, that ship was still seaworthy, and there was no hint as to why the crew and passengers had abandoned it. The last entry in her log was dated around 10 days earlier. She had left New York City for Genoa on November 7th and was still amply provisioned when found. Her cargo of alcohol was intact, and the captain's and crew's belongings were undisturbed. None of those who had been on board were ever seen or heard from ever again. Among the missing was the captain, his wife, and their very young daughter. On December 23rd of 1872, during a court hearing to try and establish just what happened, Frederick Soliflude, who was the Attorney General of Gibraltar, ordered an examination of the Mary Celeste, which was carried out by John Austin, surveyor of shipping, with the assistance of a diver, Ricardo Fortunato. Austin noted cuts on each side of the bow caused by a sharp instrument, and found possible traces of scarlet fluid on the captain's sword. His report emphasized that the ship did not appear to have been struck by heavy weather, citing a vial of sewing machine oil found upright in its place. Now, Austin did not acknowledge that the vial might have been replaced since the abandonment, nor did the court raise this point. Fortunato's report on the hull concluded that the ship had not been involved in a collision or run aground. A further inspection by a group of Royal Naval captains endorsed Austin's opinion that the cuts on the bow had been caused deliberately. They also discovered stains on one of the ship's rails that might have been bodily fluids, together with a deep mark possibly caused by an axe. These findings strengthened Flood's suspicions that human wrongdoing, rather than natural disaster, was the cause for the mystery. On January 22nd of 1873, he sent the reports to the Board of Trade in London, adding his own conclusion that the crew had gotten at the alcohol on board and, killed the Briggs family and the ship's officers in a drunken frenzy. They had cut the bows to simulate a collision and then fled in the yawl to suffer an unknown fate. Flood thought that Morehouse and his men were hiding something, specifically that the Mary Celeste had been abandoned in a more easterly location, and that the log had been doctored. He just couldn't accept that the Mary Celeste could have been traveled so far, uncrewed. Arthur Conan Doyle, author of the Sherlock Holmes mysteries, helped make the ship famous with a short story vaguely based on the event, in which foul play explains the enigma. A 2007 theory, reported by the Smithsonian, suggests that perhaps the captain made the call to abandon ship in sight of land after the ship's pumps became fouled. Normally, it would be unusual for a captain to abandon a seaworthy vessel, but the captain may not have been able to tell just how much water the ship was taking on with the pumps broken. The ship was also slightly off course and had been battling bad weather, which may have prompted the captain to take the chance at land when he could. To this day, the crew of the mysterious vessel was never found. Also, despite many theories, no one can say with any certainty why the ship was abandoned. The Mary Celeste sailed for 12 years after it was abandoned, and finally struck the Rochelle Reef off of the coast of Haiti and became stuck there. And it's still there. It was discovered in 2001. Let me know what your theory is in the comments. Number 4, the Carroll A. Deering. This ship was built in Bath, Maine in 1919 by the G.G. Deering Company for commercial use. One of the last large commercial sailing vessels, the ship was designed to carry cargo and had been in service for a year when it began its final voyage to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. So the cargo ship and its 10-man crew successfully made it to Rio de Janeiro in 1920, despite needing to change captains when its original one fell ill, but something strange happened on its way back to Virginia. A lightship keeper in North Carolina said a crewman who didn't seem very officer-like reported the ship had lost its anchors while the rest of the crew was milling about suspiciously. The ship was still in good condition when it was spotted from Cape Hatteras on January 31st of 1921 before it was torn apart on the Diamond Shoals. Another ship spotted the Carroll A. Deering near Outer Banks the next day in an area that would have been a strange course for a ship on its way to Norfolk, Virginia. Now, if someone wants to fight me on that pronunciation, I swear I consulted a couple of friends who live in Virginia for that one. The following day, a shipwreck was spotted, but dangerous conditions kept investigators away for 4 days. When they went aboard, eventually, they found food laid out as if they were getting ready for a meal, but the crew's personal belongings and the lifeboats were gone. So, what happened to the captain and crew? All 12 men were missing in action, with no idea what the heck could have transpired. A month after the Coast Guard began investigating the Carroll A. Deering, a new theory was formed related to the disappearance of another vessel, the Hewitt, around the same time. The Hewitt was making its way from Sabine, Texas to Portland, Maine, carrying a cargo of sulfur when it sent its last message on January 25th off of the coast of Florida. When the vessel never arrived in Boston where it was expected on January 29th, a search began. The Hewitt and her crew had also disappeared without a trace, and the popular theory questioned if the ships could have collided. but the lack of oars, life preservers, or other floating wreckage disproves the idea. But 58 men were now lost. In April of 1921, a message in a bottle found by a man on the North Carolina coast seemed to give the answer to the mystery. Deering captured by oil-burning boat, the note read. Now, the State Department began an investigation into the Deering and several other ships, and it was suspected that the Deering had been captured by pirates. Arr. Then the newspapers began reporting the possibility of a Bolshevik plot to steal the ships, cargo, and crews and somehow whisk them all away to Russian ports. By September, however, it was discovered that the message found in the bottle, the only real evidence of what may have happened to the crew, was in fact written by the man who supposedly found it. Mr. Christopher Columbus Gray faked the note in the hopes that he could discredit the staff at the Cape Hatteras lighthouse and take someone's job. It's a dramatic way to get a job, but hey, whatever works. The hoax had prompted investigations by the US Navy, Treasury, State Department, Department of Commerce, and Department of Justice. Without the note, however, the investigations fizzled out and ended without an official explanation. The federal government has followed numerous leads on pirates, mutinies, and more, but they've got nothing. So do I.
Number 3. Missouri State Penitentiary. Once dubbed the bloodiest 47 acres in America, it is no surprise at all that Missouri State Pen is home to all kinds of rumors to be haunted by the souls of its former inmates. The prison was nicknamed The Walls, and shortly after its construction was already home to 2,000 inmates, doubling that size in the progressing years. The prison was home to several riots and escape attempts, with the most infamous attempt occurring in 1954, when some 2,500 inmates participated in a massive day-long riot. 4 buildings burned and the National Guard was called in. Shockingly, out of this, only 4 inmates were fatally injured during this event, and none managed to escape, lending to the prison's hard reputation. Now, the prison has always been reported to be haunted, even during its operation, with both guards and inmates during its service claiming to see spectral apparitions. Most of the ghost stories come out of the prison's oldest building, the A building, home to some of the crueler punishments, including an underground room called the Dungeon, a dank, hostile basement with a low ceiling forcing prisoners into a subservient position where the only light that could be observed was a slit through the door. Modern visitors to the dungeon complain of the disgusting odor of bodies that's pungent, and they feel like they're being watched. Disembodied voices have even been picked up by EVP monitors while wandering through the dungeon. In the control room, visitors report occasionally seeing a spirit called Fast Jack, a medical practitioner from the prison's operating days, who can be seen appearing as a ghastly figure holding a clipboard and a white lab coat, frantically scurrying around the control room trying to carry out some duty from when he was alive, slamming lockers and opening doors. Several ghost hunting groups over the years have investigated the Missouri State Pen, including legendary ghost hunting hero Zach Baggins and the Ghost Adventures crew, finding mysterious voices and what looked like shadow people wandering the halls. Although the bloodiest 47 acres in America might have dried up and the walls are now open to the public, for the inmates who are still impounded there, it's as terrifying as ever. Number 2. West Virginia Penitentiary. Almost heaven. West Virginia, Blue Ridge Mountains, and haunted prisons. The Appalachians might be home to one of the most beautiful parts of the United States, but West Virginia Penitentiary is anything but. In 1863, after West Virginia seceded from Virginia Classic, the new fledgling state needed its own prison, and Moundsville, West Virginia was chosen as the home for their new state pen. The prison's conditions were unlivable. West Virginia Pen frequently made the Department of Justice's top 10 violent prisons in the country. Idea for a new video. An infamous spot in the prison was known as the Sugar Shack, a small rec room for the inmates that served as a hotbed for all kinds of violent illegal activity. The prison is also home to a famous electric chair that an inmate was forced to build, nicknamed Ol' Sparky. Ol' Sparky is still standing there today. In the 1950s, the prison was so overcrowded that 3 prisoners at a time would be shoved into one cramped 7 by 5 foot cell. The men were kept like animals in cages. Riots and violent outbursts were fairly commonplace. The prison was overcrowded, dilapidated and run down, and staffed by overwhelmed guards. Eventually, the prison would be forced to open its gates, decommissioning as a prison and shipping all of its inmates elsewhere. The building still stands and is used as a training facility for law enforcement officers, but it's been said that the spirits of those whose lives ended here still wander. Hunters report equipment malfunctioning walking by the Sugar Shack or any of the cell blocks where the more violent inmates were housed. Reports of banging on the walls late at night, as well as random screams, are fairly commonplace too. The prison was reportedly haunted while inmates still populated it, with some of the earliest stories of hauntings stemming from the 1930s. It's thought that the prison was built on top of an indigenous gravesite of the Adena people, which has led to some speculation as perhaps an explanation for the hauntings. Like most of the prisons on this list, if you're curious enough yourself, West Virginia Penn is available to visit for tours, and you can even pop by the Sugar Shack and Old Sparky. And finally, number 1, Alcatraz. Alcatraz might very well be the United States' most infamous prison. On Alcatraz Island, just outside of San Fran, lies the notorious jail, built to house America's most deadly inmates, like Al Capone, Arthur Barker, or George Kelly. It was home to a legendary breakout that was made into a film, Escape from Alcatraz, and also set the stage for Michael Bay's action classic The Rock, which was about breaking into Alcatraz. The prison was built to drain the hope out of inmates, to break the spirits of the most rebellious inmates, and was legendary for its awful conditions. Tiny cramped cells, indifferent guards, and frequent bouts of violence and riots were all commonplace. It was once referred to as the Great Garbage Can of San Francisco, where every other federal prison dumped their worst apples. So it's no surprise, given its brutal conditions, that the island is home to several spirits and hauntings from souls that just can't move on. Most ghost investigators report that the hottest spot for paranormal activity in the building is cell 14D, a cell that was also nicknamed the Hole. Gotta wonder if they borrowed that from Eastern State. It was where the most unruly prisoners would be kept when they were being difficult. It's been said that even walking by 14D, you'll immediately feel something's wrong, as if a dark presence or energy is in the room with you. An inmate once spent his last days in 14D, screaming that he was being hunted by an otherworldly creature. Visitors report hearing crying and moaning while walking through cell blocks A, B, and C, where most of the population would have been kept. It's said that a ghost named the Butcher walks through these halls after an inmate named Butcher Malkowitz, a mob hitman, was whacked by another inmate. Now, if this isn't enough haunting for you, some dark tourists also report hearing discordant, disembodied banjo strumming, thought to be a holdover from the spirit of Al Capone, who used to play his banjo in the prison band. Although the prison was decommissioned in 1963, it reopened shortly after, now as a museum and a haunted tour popular with Bay Area locals and visitors curious about learning about one of America's darkest prisons and perhaps its most haunted. Visit if you dare, but just make sure you're able to leave. Number 5. Eastern State Penitentiary. Starting off the list is Eastern State Penitentiary. It was a prison built in Philadelphia that wanted to stand out from the rest of the American penal system, trying out a new method of punishment called the Pennsylvania system. Well, do tell, what is the Pennsylvania system? It's not pleasant and has absolutely nothing to do with cheesesteaks. The Pennsylvania system refers to imposing the prisoners to solitary confinement all of the time, 24/7. The prisoners lived alone, ate alone, exercised alone, and were only ever allowed to interact with prison guards. When they were being transported or moved around the prison, the guards would make them don black hoods. Guess it's not nearly as sunny in Philadelphia as Frank Reynolds would have you believe. Now, this might not surprise you, but this was not a terribly popular system with inmates. The miserable conditions made the inmates' lives horrendous, but the prison didn't care too much. The system only ended up collapsing in 1913 due to overcrowding in the prison. But Eastern State didn't let this stop them from acting sadistically, and really, if anything, just inspired them to get a little more creative. Prisoners would have their tongues chained to their wrists. Unruly, troublesome prisoners would be chained to chairs for days on end. They would douse prisoners in freezing cold water, and perhaps worst of all, would trap prisoners into a pit they affectionately nicknamed the Hole, where they'd be kept in the darkness for weeks on end. I'm really not sure if that's any better than the original system. In 1970, after decades of terrorizing its inmates, Eastern State let the last of its inmates free and closed the gates permanently, only to crack them back open a little bit as a tourist location, reopening its walls as a haunted attraction. Due to its horrific history and ominous atmosphere, the prison was rebranded as a haunt, with legends saying that you'll hear all kinds of disembodied laughter, screaming and crying, ghostly figures, shadows moving across the wall, and unexplained footsteps. And if you're looking for more scary stories about prisons or really about anything, then you're at exactly the right place. Stay subscribed to Top 5 Scary for more new scary videos every day. Number 4. Ohio State Reformatory. Ohio State is the picture of a perfect prison. I mean, literally, it was the set for the Shawshank Redemption, so it's kind of a big deal deal in the prison world. The prison first opened its gates in 1890 and was initially an intermediate penitentiary, a facility for first-time offenders who were deemed too violent to be in other prisons. The inmates were taught basic trades for release and reintegration. However, the prison population started to swell too much by the 20th century, and the reformatory was forced to accept inmates convicted of serious crimes. While day-to-day operations weren't too terribly out of the norm for any other prison, one event in the 1930s may have contributed greatly to the paranormal rumors surrounding it. In the late 1930s, a riot broke out in the East Cell Block, and as punishment, the guards rounded up 120 rioters to share 12 solitary confinement cells together for a week without any food or water. Obviously, this led to multiple prisoners passing away, and even more being broken down to the point of madness. Just outside the prison stands 215 numbered graves, a monument to all the horror that the prison had experienced over the years. Since then, the prison itself has reformed, rehabilitating itself much like Eastern State as a haunted house. Visitors and tour guides who walk through Ohio State report feeling inexplicable chills while walking through the prison's walls. Witnesses say they hear cell doors slam and see dark figures. Those brave enough are welcome to take the prison's tour and attempt to track down spirits of their own, or if you're feeling particularly festive for the Halloween season, you can try the Haunted Prison Experience, a guided tour replete with animatronics and actors for that haunted house feel.
Number 3, the island of Poveglia. Yep, an entirely abandoned island, and it's got quite the history. So the island is located in the lagoon near Venice and is famous for being one of the most haunted places in all of Italy. Tourists and locals alike are banned from the island, which was used for centuries as a place to exile the sick, to prevent the spread of disease, and contain the mentally ill in an asylum built in the late 1800s. Yeah, I'll backtrack and elaborate. In 1348, the bubonic plague arrived in Venice and Poveglia, like many other small islands at the time, and it became a quarantine colony. The plague on average killed 1 out of 3 Europeans, so fearing the crazy spread of the disease, Venice exiled many of its symptom-bearing citizens there. Go. At the island center, the dead and those too sick to protest were burned on giant pyres. This included the tens of thousands of Venice citizens dying on the mainland. These fires were burned once more in 1630 when the Black Death again swept through the city. The small island was used as a mass burial ground, and ashes from human remains make up as much as 50% of the island's soil, so I hope it's a good fertilizer. The deaths of nearly 160,000 people on the island have given it its nickname, the Island of Ghosts. A doctor at the asylum was known to have experimented on patients with crude lobotomies and jumped from the bell tower in the 1930s after claiming he had been driven mad by ghosts. Decades later, nearby residents claimed to still hear the bell, although it was removed many years earlier. A report titled Haunted History states that some restoration work has started in recent history, but abruptly stopped without explanation, so maybe this is one spot on today's list that I don't want to visit, ever. Number 2, Bonnie State Historic Park. Formerly a genuine gold mining town located east of the Sierra Nevada mountain range in Mono County, California, and now a national landmark, it is known as one of the best preserved ghost towns in the world. It is named after W.S. Bodie, first name unknown, but rumored to be either William or Waterman, who discovered gold in 1859 in an area now known as Brody Bluff. He tragically passed away in a snowstorm that same winter and was never present for what came to be. According to pioneer Judge McClinton, the district's name was changed from the proper spelling of B-O-D-E-Y to B-O-D-Y, and then a few other phonetic variations to eventually B-O-D-I-E after a painter in the nearby boomtown of Aurora lettered a sign as such, an accidental typo that got stuck through history, which is a good reminder to proofread your work. While the output from the mine is largely insignificant in terms of mining history, the violence and early endings to labs tell a different story. A particularly harsh winter between 1878 and 79 claimed hundreds of lives, with many others perishing from falling timber and explosions underground. Bodie as a town grew to have a reputation for violence and lawlessness, and unlike other mining camps at the time, killings were daily events. Robberies, stage holdups, and fights happened at such a frequency that no complete record could be kept. Reverend F.M. Warrington would describe the area in 1881 as a sea of sin, lashed by tempests of lust and passion. The first of 4 mysterious fires tore through the business district in 1892, the next destroying the town mill in 1912, and another destroying the same mill again in 1898. The last of the unknown fires demolished most of what was left of the now ghost town in 1932, taking many lives too soon in the process. When the last producing mine shut down after 1945, very few people were left living in what was left of the town, and all eventually met untimely ends. One man shot his wife unprompted, and 3 other men from the town took it upon themselves to take his life for the act. According to historians, the ghost of that man would visit the 3 men after his passing, shaking his fist and appearing as if he was cursing them out. Those men soon died of mysterious diseases and illnesses. Visitors to the area have reported meeting spirits that leave them feeling suffocated, seeing doors open and close on their own, and rocking chairs that may or may not have a menacing older lady staring them down, or even the empty chair rocking on its own. Nowadays, if you remove anything from the land, even like a little pebble, you'll be cursed with remorse and tragedy. The curse is upheld by the ghosts of residents past, who guard against thieves and protect the town's treasures. So kleptos, steer clear or be cursed. The Caribbean island of Montserrat was quite the getaway spot in the 1980s after music producer Sir George Martin opened a recording studio there called Air. The appeal of working with his team and spending a few weeks or months recording in a tropical paradise was so compelling that the world's most famous rock stars, had a good time there. We're talking like Mick Jagger, Elton John, Stevie Wonder, and Paul McCartney all laid down tracks. The party sadly ended abruptly when twin disasters struck the island. Beginning on the 18th of July in 1995, a series of huge eruptions at the South Friar Hills volcano, which had been inactive for centuries, sent pyroclastic flows and ash falls across a wide area of southern Montserrat, including the capital of Plymouth. On the 21st of August in 1995, tephra fell on Plymouth, necessitating an evacuation that lasted until September 3rd. Following renewed volcanic activity on the 1st of December, residents were evacuated for the second time, but were allowed back on the 1st of January. On April 3rd, it was evacuated for the third and final time. The island was divided into risk zones. During some periods, entry into Plymouth was prohibited, and at other times it was allowed during daytime only to those with a means of rapid escape. The last time that access was legally allowed to the area during daytime was June 16th of 1997, which was right before I was born. On the 25th of June, a further massive eruption produced pyroclastic surges that killed 19 people and reached nearly to the island's airport on the eastern side of the island, which had remained open until that time. Between the 4th to the 8th of August of that year, a further series of large eruptions destroyed approximately 80% of the town, burying it under 1.4 meters of ash. This hot material burned many of the buildings, making habitation nearly impossible for many of the residents. The flows, lava, ash, and other volcanic rock types were mostly compact, having a density similar to that of concrete. The removal of the overburden would have required the use of explosives, bulldozers, and other resources way too expensive for all of this. It was anticipated that the soil underneath the hardened mud and lava would have been scorched and left completely non-arable by the intense heat of the pyroclastic flows. The entire south half of the island was declared an exclusion zone because of the continuing volcanic activity at the hills. So the government of the island was moved north to the town of Brady's, although Plymouth still remains the technical capital. Recently, Montserrat has begun chaperoning driving tours into the exclusion zone, where visitors can walk through the ruins of the former capital, which now lies buried under some 20 feet of ash and stone, where the smoking volcano still pumps over 350 tons of sulfur dioxide into the sky every day. During a tour, one sees modern concrete buildings shattered by the unbelievable force of nature. Over 10 feet of ash and mud have buried so much of the city that in certain areas, only rooftops poke up from the dust. We're talking like papers and envelopes are stacked on desktop piles of work, which were made pointless by the pile of ash that fills up the floor and outside balconies. 19 people died from breaking the law and entering the exclusion zone before it was safe, by the way. The hot gas cooked their lungs, and they looked similar to mummies when they were eventually found. Yeah, big pass from me.
In at number 5, we have St. Elmo, Colorado. St. Elmo, Colorado was a former gold mining camp in Chaffee Country. Today, it is one of the best preserved ghost towns in Colorado, as the entire district was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1979. The area was originally settled in 1878 and was made official in 1880, when gold and silver began to bring many people to the area. At one point, the population reached more than 2,000 people. In 1881, the Denver, South Park, and Pacific Railroad came through the area and a station was built in St. Elmo. From here, the tracks continued to Romney, Hancock, and through the historic Alpine Tunnel. St. Elmo was considered the main source of supplies arriving by train for the area settlers, and eventually several merchandise stores, 5 hotels, a telegraph office, a town hall, 5 restaurants, 2 sawmills, a schoolhouse, a weekly newspaper called The Mountaineer, and numerous saloons and dance halls filled the town. The miners worked at several mines throughout the area that were rich in silver, gold, copper, and iron. In 1890, a fire destroyed the business section and the town was never entirely rebuilt. This was about the same time that St. Elmo's peaked in population with about 2,000 residents. Afterward, many of the mines were depleted and many miners moved out of the area. More mines continued to fail in the ensuing years and the closure of the Alpine Tunnel in 1910. The state of the structures paired with depleting mines led many in the community in search of new, more prosperous mining towns to call home. The railroad continued to run until 1922, and it has been said that the rest of St. Elmo's population rode the last train out of town, never to return. In 1969, the United States recognized St. Elmo as a historic district, and soon after, it became a unique tourist attraction that's open to the public, showcasing what life was like in the Old West. There is no shortage of urban legends and reports of hauntings in St. Elmo, but the most common occurrence of paranormal activity centers around the town's most notable family. To this day, one of the members of the Stark family still can be spotted in the ghost town. Anton's only daughter Annabelle resided there until she died in 1960. As legend has it, Annabelle continued her promise to protect the city even after she took her last breath. In at number 4 we have Rhyolite, Nevada. Founded in 1904 and abandoned by 1916, Rhyolite was one of several short-lived boom towns from the late gold rush era. People were drawn to the desert on the edge of Death Valley by the promise of gold found amongst quartz in local mines. And by 1906 the town had all the promising indicators of permanence and the largest population in the area. The town citizens had an active social life, including baseball games, dances, basket socials, whist parties, tennis, a symphony, Sunday school picnics, basketball games, Saturday night variety shows at the Opera House, and pool tournaments. In 1906, Countess Majowski opened the Alaska Glacier Ice Cream Parlor to the delight of the local citizenry. That same year, an enterprising miner, Tom T. Kelly, built a bottle house out of 50,000 beer and liquor bottles. But in 1907, the US financial markets were rocked by panic that saw closures of banks, businesses, and mines. Rhyolite began to falter. The mine closed in 1911. Some claim that Rhyolite, about 120 miles northwest of Las Vegas, was once home to thousands of people, though not much remains of its glory days, which lasted less than 20 years. Set up in 1905, the town was a mining hotspot, but after the richest ore was exhausted, workers left for a new pasture, and the population had dropped to close to zero by 1920. Industrialist Charles M. Schwab invested heavily in Rhyolite's infrastructure, which boasted a school, electric lights, water mains, newspapers, a hospital, and even an opera house, some of which can be seen today. There are only around 10 significant structures, yet the site is very evocative. The crumbling remains set against a backdrop of stark desert hills.
Number 3, the Octavius. The cargo ship Octavius met its demise in 1761 after leaving China and setting sail for Britain via the Northwest Passage. At that time, no ship had ever successfully navigated the passage, and the Octavius disappeared, proving it was no exception. A whaling ship discovered the damaged remains of Octavius on October 11th of 1775 and boarded it to look for survivors and cargo. When the men ventured into the below-deck quarters, they found the ship's captain frozen at his desk, partway through filling out the ship's log, and the rest of the crew were similarly encased in ice throughout their rooms. Brr. The whalers snatched up the ship log and fled the Octavius, leaving behind all, including the first and last entries, which were stuck to the desk. The log revealed that the Arctic temperatures and ice captured the Octavius around 250 miles from Barrow, where all those aboard perished on November 11th of 1762. The whalers, however, found the boat near Greenland, meaning it somehow made its way through the Northwest Passage, even with its crew frozen solid. Look, while Frozen might not be my favorite Disney movie ever, did anyone think to check in with Elsa or any of her ancestors? This just seems like a magical accident that could easily be undone. I'm just saying. Number 2, the MV Joyita. This ship was a 70-foot luxury yacht built in Los Angeles in the United States and launched in 1931. Roland West, who was a famous Hollywood director in the 1920s and 30s, was the first owner of the ship, naming it after his wife, Jewel Carmenil, calling the ship Joyita, which means little jewel in Spanish. The ship spent much of the 1930s cruising the west coast of the United States under both Roland West and its subsequent owner, Milton Beacon. It became a Pacific patrol boat during the Second World War, patrolling the seas around Hawaii. Although she sustained minor damage after running aground and had some of her components replaced with lower quality materials, she remained largely intact and in good shape after the end of the war, and by the 1950s was being used as a fishing charter vessel. On October 3rd of 1955, the ship left Apia in Samoa to sail to the Tokelau Island. a journey of about 270 miles. Only one of her 2 engines was running due to equipment failure at the last minute, but the journey was considered safe given its short distance and the favorable weather conditions. So it was carrying medical supplies and wooden construction materials on board and had no dangerous cargo. She also carried 25 people, 16 crew, and 9 passengers, and the journey was expected to last around 48 hours. The ship was reported as overdue 3 days later, and no distress calls had been received. Flying boats from the New Zealand Air Force patrolled the same area that it was thought to be in for almost a week, covering a huge area of open water, but found nothing. Finally, almost 5 weeks later, on November 10th, the merchant ship Tuvalu, traveling to the Funafuti Atoll, more than 600 miles to the west, saw a ship drifting ahead of them. The ship did not respond to hails from Tuvalu, and the captain decided to investigate further. Investigation showed that the ship was empty. The crew and passengers were missing, and tons of cargo from the ship was lost. So while the ship itself was perfectly fine and in no danger of sinking, there was some evidence that something had happened on board. Parts of the bridge and accompanying rooms above the waterline had been damaged, and there was broken glass inside. In addition, stained bandages were found on deck, along with a doctor's medical bag. The one working engine was found covered in mattresses, but with sufficient fuel for it to operate, and the second engine was still partially disassembled and therefore non-functional. And all the clocks on board were found to have stopped at the exact same time, 10:25 p.m. Rather spooky. The communications radio was turned to 2182 kHz, an internationally recognized distress frequency. However, the radio itself was found to not work and was not broadcasting, something which may not have been obvious to the crew. Oh, and all of the lifeboats were missing. Some of the story about what happened on the Joyita can be pieced together from what was found by the official maritime inquiry. Like, for example, it's clear what had caused the initial problems on the ship. A corroded pipe, one of those replaced during the Second World War, was found to be leaking, and this allowed water to enter into the hull. It is very unlikely that the crew would have been able to find the source of the leak in open water. The damage to the superstructure of the vessel seemed to be unconnected to the problems they were experiencing, but may have added to the sense that the vessel was heavily damaged. The attempts to send out a distress signal and the lack of response may have led to a rising panic amongst those on board. The fact that whatever had happened had occurred at night also may have led to a lack of situational awareness, as the damage found was minor and would have been clearly recognized as such in the daytime. However, the decision to abandon the ship, if that's what happened, makes absolutely no sense. The 3 lifeboats were far less seaworthy than the ship herself, and there were insufficient life jackets for everyone on board. Furthermore, the vessel itself was perfectly buoyant even 5 weeks later, and the captain would have been experienced enough to recognize this. So while it seems that those on board decided to, leave the safety of the ship in the night and test their luck in tiny rafts, why they did this is a total mystery. Theories range from pirates, once again, to a mutiny amongst those on ship. The crew were never seen again, and this means that 25 people met their end somehow. Furthermore, despite the damage, there was no evidence of violence apart from the bandages, and these themselves suggest there was enough time for someone to administer medical assistance. No trace was ever found of the crew or the life rafts. And what caused them to abandon ship in the dark, only 50 miles short of their destination, remains a mystery to this day. Number 1, the SV Kaz II. So this is the most recent entry in our list, and it was found adrift 88 miles off of the coast of Australia, near the Great Barrier Reef, just 5 days after it set sail from Airlie Beach towards Townsville, Queensland in April of 2007. According to the investigation reports, it was sailing with a 3-person crew who were not experienced sailors. However, what happened to them remains a mystery to this day. Many believe rough weather conditions could be a reason. Others blame, pirates or even communists for the same. The vessel was found in perfect condition, except for the one sail, which had been shredded to pieces, and the 3 men were never discovered. According to investigators, they might have drowned while trying to untangle a fishing lure caught in the vessel's rudder, but others believe that a sea monster could have swallowed them.
Coming in at number 5, we've got the Ground Church Tower. Take one look at this ominous tower poking out of the water and tell me it's not cursed, or filled with treasure, and the treasure's cursed. Sure, it's a church, and churches are places of peace and light, but this one has a tragic story behind it. It was once a lovely place of worship located in South Tyrol, Italy. Folks would come and participate in some pretty average church activities. However, in the 50s, major change was on the horizon. The town needed a new source of energy. In the end, they decided that building an artificial lake would be the way to go. They filled a wide expanse with water and ended up flooding the church. I suppose it was cheaper just to leave some of the buildings as they were instead of demolishing them first. The result is stunning and a little bit ominous. These days, you can see the bell tower peeking out from the top of the water. The rest of the church is down below, wallowing in the murky depths. It sort of feels like a water level in a video game with plenty to explore and frustration abound. I mean, imagine descending into the depths and wading through the many waterlogged chambers hidden below. There could be anything waiting down there. Spirits of wildlife that may have been caught up in the artificial lake. The long lingering ghosts of old churchgoers doomed to float about. It's fascinating and fear-inducing. Coming in at number 4, we've got the Sorrento Abandoned Mill, another Italian cursed building. If you ever visit Naples, you can take a day and head off the beaten path. A canyon nearby is known as the Valley of the Mills and houses all sorts of awesome structures. Ages and ages ago, a flour mill was built. For years it operated, providing flour to the surrounding regions. In fact, it apparently managed to do so for hundreds of years. And if you're at all familiar with the operation of mills before standard safety practices were introduced, you know they were death traps. So for hundreds of years, folks toiled away, grinding out flour and occasionally some workers. Uh-oh. Now, these deaths didn't mean that the mill had to close, it was seen as an occupational hazard of sorts. But then, in the late 19th century, it became isolated from the sea. Tasso Square was built, and this caused the mill to become less practical. Humidity rose in the area, and the mill was forced to shut down. Years later, the building was ultimately closed for good. So we've got a historic mill in a valley closed due to societal progress. Sounds like a recipe for ghosts or a curse to me. If you look at it these days, you'll agree. The mill has been totally overtaken by nature. Greenery has consumed the ancient structure, giving it a foreboding and abandoned look. Moss and lichens cover pretty much every square inch of the walls, essentially daring anyone to come and explore. But be careful if you do, it's hard to tell what might be hidden among the foliage. Maybe a mill worker's ghost missing some essential limbs, or a foreman who lost everything when the grindstones stopped grinding. I hope it was worth it. Progress.
Number 3 on this list is the Riverview Hospital. This hospital is located in British Columbia and was still operating and doing some horrible practices way longer than anyone would care to admit. It was first built in the early 1900s in a less populated part of BC. It had almost 250 acres of land to itself and a bunch of different buildings that served various purposes. There was one building called the West Lawn Pavilion, which actually was said to house the most disturbed male patients in the whole country. This part of the hospital eventually shut down in 1983, but the rest of the place, where a bunch of questionable practices were going down, that didn't shut down until 2010. That's right, guys, 2010. Literally only 12 years ago, this place was still operating. Reports revealed that the hospital still employed electroshock therapy in the 21st century and allegedly illegally sterilized a number of patients. In 2005, 9 women received settlements totaling $450,000 following a joint lawsuit filed against the facility over the alleged sterilizations. As much as I want so badly to believe that we are out of this era of poor mental health, we might not fully be. That happened just over a decade ago. If you were sent to this place only a few years prior, then you may have had to deal with this. Kinda makes you wonder how many other places around the world are still conducting horrible treatments that we don't know about. Number 2 on this list is the Ospedale Psichiatrico di Volterra. This abandoned lunatic asylum is located in Italy. All That's Interesting says the asylum at Volterra was meant to be a sort of haven where patients could roam and do as they pleased. There were shops, a gardening company, and a judicial section which became known as the Ferry Pavilion. But the hospital's idyllic objective was sidelined after the facility became overcrowded. By the 1960s, the Ospedale Psichiatrico di Volterra was one of the country's most populated hospitals with more than 6,000 patients. This was largely due to how easy it was to be committed to the hospital, and patients were admitted on the faintest signs of depression to accusations of moral transgressions. The facility was run like a prison, with nurses being referred to as guards or supervisors. Patients were treated like inmates and often sedated or isolated. The cures they were given included electroshock treatments, insulin-induced comas, and ice tank submersions. Patients at the Volterra facility suffered immensely until the hospital was abandoned in 1978 following the passage of the Bassaglia Law, which mandated the closure of all mental hospitals in Italy. I didn't even know that ice tank submersions or insulin-induced comas were a real thing. I just thought stuff like that existed in shows like Stranger Things, but that actually happened. Last I checked, an insulin-induced coma isn't gonna help anyone with schizophrenia. Number 1 on this list is the Willard Asylum. Once again, guys, we have an asylum who initially wanted to help people but ended up doing the exact opposite. All That's Interesting says Willard was a state-of-the-art facility that featured a gymnasium, arts and craft classes, a movie theater, and even a bowling alley. It was meant to be a place where people living with mental illnesses could either devote themselves to their recovery or live in a safe and active environment. One of the hospital's main missions was to treat patients with the goal of preparing them to rejoin society. Despite this ideal, the hospital fell victim to the incomplete ideas and harsh treatments of its day. Patients were still subjected to electroshock therapy and ice baths, and some patients were kept at the asylum until their deaths. Many were buried under unmarked tombstones that still dot the abandoned asylum's grounds. The hospital was finally shut down in 1995. Perhaps most tragic about the asylum's history, however, was the discovery of hundreds of suitcases that were found cataloged in the hospital's attic upon its closure. These were the belongings of patients who died in the hospital and were unclaimed by next of kin. The staff was apparently unable to throw these mementos away. Hundreds of suitcases, guys. Not 1 or 2 or 10, hundreds. That's hundreds of people who died here and were put in unmarked graves. Hundreds of people who died here and whose families either didn't care enough about them to go claim their belongings or were never informed that they died. I'm so happy that times have changed and the stigma around mental health and its treatment is lifting. 100 years ago, the last thing you would have wanted is to have someone try and help you with whatever it is that you're dealing with.
Located at the end of the Mani Peninsula in Greece, you'll find a small landmass called Cape Matapan. The caves in this area open at sea level into a cliff face beneath the headland, the exact point marked by the ruins of a Spartan temple above. The inhabitants built several temples at the site, with the most notable being in dedication to Poseidon and Apollo, for which Strabo in the 1st century AD and Pausanias in the 2nd century AD describe a cult temple that worshipped Poseidon and fronted a cave-like temple on the headland. The cave was believed to be the gateway to Hades, the realm of the dead named for the patron god of the underworld, in which the departed souls were transported across the rivers Styx and or Acheron by Charon the ferryman to be judged on whether they would reside in Elysium or Tartarus. This was one of the several entrances that the ancient Greeks ascribed to Hades, the kingdom of the shades. Others were to be found at the Necromantian of Ephyra, as well as at Alipotropa, another smaller cave network on the Mani. Here, according to the stories, is the place where Orpheus entered the underworld in search of his lost love Eurydice. When the hero Hercules passed down into the underworld, it was again through the Cape Matapan caves. These are not the only legend ascribed to the remote peninsula, however. The Spartans viewed this as a highly significant place of worship, and they built several temples to their gods along the rocky headland. Most prominent amongst the surviving ruins are the remains of a temple dedicated to the sea god Poseidon, located on a hill directly above the cave to Hades. Another story related by Pausanias linked to the picturesque cape relates to the poet Arion, who escaped from pirates to be carried ashore by a pod of dolphins. A bronze statue of the poet riding a dolphin stands on the crest of the cape, not far from the ruins of a temple raised in honor of the sea god Poseidon. The caves at Matapan can still be entered by visitors, although a boat is required to pass through the watery mouth of this particular hellgate. In at number 4 we have Acton Tunichil Muknal Cave in Belize. Uncovered in 1980, the Acton Tunichil Muknal is a mine archaeological site that includes skeletons, ceramics, and stoneware. Acton Tunichil Muknal Cave, otherwise known as the Cave of the Stone Sepulchre, was first entered by the Mayans in AD 300 to 600. It was not until the late AD 700 to 900 that the Mayans went deeper into the cave to perform their ceremonies. The cave is a maze of chambers along with a cathedral-like area for ceremonial sacrifices. In the cave, archaeologists found numerous skeletons, but what makes it even creepier is the fact that most of the skeletons belong to sacrificed people. Many of the remains and artifacts are completely calcified in the cave. Almost all lost their lives to blunt trauma to the head, while most of the pottery found at the site dates from between 700 to 900 AD, which is likely when the bodies found here were sacrificed. One of the cave's most notorious features is the skeleton of a girl whose bones have been calcified into a crystallized appearance. This skeleton is known as the Crystal Maiden. It is unknown what the circumstances of the sacrifices were, though some believe they were to appease the rain god Chak, or possibly the gods of the underworld. Another theory holds that these were believed to be witches, possibly suffering from some kind of mental or physical ailment, and that leaving them unburied in the cave would ensure that their spirits were trapped there. Therefore, from the location to the remains that were found and rituals that were performed here, it's safe to assume that this might just be one of the places that the devil may be hiding.
Coming in at number 3, we've got the New Bedford Orpheum. Abandoned theaters are cursed as a rule. Like, name one abandoned theater that doesn't have a ghost or urban legend attached. Oh wait, they're magnets for drama, it's in their nature. And this Massachusetts-based art house has a flair for the dramatic like no other. Get this, it opened on the same day that the Titanic went down. Talk about a hot start. It operated for a few decades, showing movies and hosting cultural events. The Orpheum was a staple of local culture at the time. However, in 1958, it closed its doors. Not for good, mind you. It would still open on occasion for extra special events and was even used by a tobacco company as storage for a little while. But these days, the Orpheum is still and silent. Ghostly even. A peek inside will reveal a gigantic sprawling space complete with mezzanine, private boxes, and faded murals. The peeling paint and crumbling plaster add to the spooky ambiance. A total lack of audience for ages makes for an echoey good time too. It's everything an old theater should be, including the creepiness. It's decrepit without being condemnable, which has led the community to rally behind efforts to reopen it. However, none of these have been very successful. It seems like the curse extends out, hitting the folks who would even attempt to resurrect it. Would you take a seat in the audience, or are you scared of seeing an unscheduled show? Coming in at number 2, we've got the Sathorn Unique Building. A monument to what could have been, the Sathorn Unique Building is an interesting case. What was supposed to be a luxurious, high-rise apartment building ended up being an abandoned husk. Perfect for urban explorers. Back in the 90s, a magnificent tower was planned. It was to be 47 stories tall with over 600 units housing all sorts of high rollers in Bangkok. Unfortunately, construction had to stop during the 1997 Asian financial crisis. The building itself was about 80% done, but would never be finished in its entirety. Plenty of money, materials, and man-hours were sunk with nothing to show for it. Well, almost nothing. These days, the Sathorn Unique is known as the Ghost Tower. Thrill seekers and graffiti artists love the sprawling building and have pretty much made it their own. The inside is totally filled with spray-painted murals and other forms of street art. Sure, it's dangerous to go running around in abandoned buildings, but try telling that to any of the folks who do it. Aside from the generally unsavory reputation of street art and urban exploring, why is it known as the Ghost Tower? Well, some locals believe the building was built on the site of an ancient graveyard. This unfortunate placement led to construction delays, accidents, and the eventual abandonment. This story is enough to keep anyone but the bravest out of the Ghost Tower. Another theory is that the building cast shadows on the nearby Wat Yad Nawa, an old Buddhist temple. This, while not being worthy of an outright curse, was considered to be unfavorable. Success is hard to achieve while preventing sunlight from reaching Buddhist temples. Recently, the building has achieved some sort of online fame, with many viral videos featuring folks free-running throughout the tower. This resulted in criminal charges being filed against the trespassing videographers. Is that the result of bad luck or a curse? And finally, at number 1, we've got Eastern State Penitentiary. In East Philadelphia, thrown in a cage, ghosts are coming back because they feel the rage. I'll stop there, you get the idea. At one point, this prison was among the most famous worldwide. It jailed some of America's most prolific criminals, including Al Capone, the inspiration for Scarface, and Slick Willie Sutton, the bank robber extraordinaire. Abandoned prisons are absolutely chock full of phantoms and spirits, and why wouldn't they be? The folks there are probably the most discontent and anger-filled of them all. Eastern State takes full advantage of this too. While the prison itself is no longer operational and houses no inmates, well, no living inmates, they still bring fearless folks around on night tours of the facilities. On clear nights, you can even see moonlight shining through these skylights. In addition to the ghosts of prisoners, it's also said that a colony of cats used to live inside the prison. At some point, they were all captured and neutered, leaving them to die off within the walls. An adept eye might just catch the shadow of a ghost cat slinking about in the halls.
Number 5 on this list is the Philadelphia State Hospital. This place is abandoned now, and based on the atrocities that happened here, that's for good reason. All That's Interesting says, in the early 20th century, abuse against patients in these mental asylums was rampant, but few places were as violent as the Philadelphia State Hospital at Byberry, where multiple homicides were later uncovered. The facility opened in 1903 as a working farm for the mentally ill, and patients from other overcrowded mental health hospitals were sent there to heal. But the humble treatment facility quickly became overcrowded itself and was expanded into a multi-campus hospital. In 1919, 2 orderlies confessed to strangling a patient until his eyes popped out and then blamed their actions on PTSD from World War I. Despite their confession, the 2 orderlies were kept on staff and even given a pay raise. And this violence continued for years. In 1989, a groundskeeper stumbled upon the corpses of at least 2 other patients. Violence between patients was just as common. At least one staffer reported witnessing a patient stabbing another patient with a sharpened spoon in 1944. Unethical medical practices were also reportedly carried out in the now abandoned asylum. The pharmaceutical company Smith, Kline and French owned a lab at the hospital where they allegedly conducted questionable testing on patients, likely without their consent. They had people working here who literally murdered one of the patients, and instead of doing anything about it, they just gave them a raise. These were different times back then, folks, and this asylum saw all the bad parts of this era. This murder happened all the way back in 1919, and this hospital kept running like this all the way until 1990. 1990 isn't that long ago, guys. We're only a few decades removed from this horrible institution operating. And the crazy part about all of this is that a place like this is meant to help people. What a joke that ended up being. Number 4 on this list is the Beechworth Asylum. This asylum has definitely been talked about on this channel before in relation to haunted asylums. All That's Interesting says, in October 1867, the sprawling Beechworth Lunatic Asylum was opened in Australia. The facility was built on a hill due to the erroneous belief at the time that high altitude could cleanse patients of their mental illnesses. As was typical of early institutions, the abandoned asylum took in a massive number of patients. At its peak, it housed about 1,200 patients and employed 700 staff members. Also, like most facilities of the 19th century, the treatments at Beechworth were notoriously violent. Doctors subjected patients to straitjackets and shackles. Electroshock treatments were common practice there, so much so that they were reportedly mass shock sessions where nearly the entire patient population was shocked simultaneously. Given the extent of the mistreatment that took place at the asylum, it may not come as a surprise that the facility, which was finally closed in 1995, is said to be extremely haunted. Those who worked at the hospital during its last years alleged that the hauntings began long before the hospital was shuttered. The most famous ghost who's seen these days is Matron Sharp. She was said to watch over the patients as they were shocked by the other nurses and doctors. If you ever saw her coming to your room, then there was a good chance the shock therapy was coming for you next. Now you can sense her due to a dramatic cold presence that fills the room.
In at number 3, we have the Gates of Guinea in New Orleans. According to voodoo mythology, the newly dead are sent to a kind of purgatory before traveling to meet their ancestors in the deep waters. Known as Guinea, this realm is presided over by the notorious Loire, who goes by the name of Baron Samedi. Often depicted as a skeleton in corpse paint dressed in a top hat and tails, the Baron is a powerful symbol of death and rebirth, guarding the crossroads which form portals to other worlds. The most important of all these portals are the Gates of Guinea themselves. While some followers of voodoo interpret the 7 gates as a spiritual metaphor, others believe them to exist in the physical realm. One of these stories locates the gates in New Orleans. To enter Guinea, it is said that one must open the 7 gates in the correct order. There are tales of voodoo practitioners opening the gates of Guinea to reclaim the souls of the dead. Souls in this lost land are also considered to be at high risk from hoodoo magicians, who have the power to reanimate them as zombies. Although the exact locations of the gates have never been disclosed, there have have been oblique suggestions over the years that a clue may lie in the Vevi, or summoning sigil of Baron Samedi himself. Appearing as a crucifix surmounted by 7 stars, the symbol might indeed serve as a map of sorts. Once aligned over the crossroads of Canal Street and Basin Street in the city's French Quarter, the stars of the Vevi seem to fall on notable surrounding cemeteries. Therefore, it's not too uncommon to believe that this might be the spot the devil is hiding, with all the talks of spirits, the Baron and the underworld at this location. In at number 2 we have the 7 Gates of Hell in Pennsylvania. In a quiet little backwater of York, Pennsylvania, one finds Helm Township, by all accounts a pleasant, friendly town and unremarkable were it not be for the rumored existence of a gateway to hell in a nearby forest. One of the better known legends tied to the location is that an insane asylum on the town's outskirts which supposedly burnt to the ground in the 19th century. 7 gates were built surrounding the remains of the asylum. At every gate, with the distance closing in, the police found more of the escaped patients, capturing them peaceably but killing any that showed aggression in violent ways. According to this particular legend, the inmates, most of them criminally insane, escaped, only to be recaptured using a series of tall fences and security gates. Many lost their lives to guards in the process. What the police and citizens didn't realize was that the construction of the gates prevented the souls of the dead from passing on to the other side, forcing them to be trapped for eternity in the remains of the asylum. Legend says the anger, hate and violence in these souls caused a rift that allowed for hell to open, the gates preventing anything to be let out but also preventing anything from traveling in. An alternate story tells of a doctor who once lived in the town. This man, by some accounts a Satanist, was said to have designed a series of strange gates on this land, which followed a winding path running deeper and deeper into the forest. Where stories agree is that those who pass through the gates in order will find themselves transported straight to the underworld. Only the first gate is visible by daylight, situated in woodland just off Helm's Trout Run Road. Regardless of what the origin of the gates are, if you were to take a trip to the gates, you'll only find one. The rest of the gates can only be seen during the night. They exist in a realm between light and dark and can only be accessed at that time. If you were to find and pass through all 7 gates, you'll find yourself in hell, unable to escape and trapped for all of eternity. Those who have tried to look for the gates report seeing shadow figures wandering through the forest, the smell of something burning, and screams in the distance. Worst of all, some say they know of a few who have found at least 5 gates, but went off looking for the 6th, they never returned. And finally, in at number 1 we have Pluto's Gate in Turkey. Known as Pluto's Gate or Plutonian in Greek, the archaeological site in southwestern Turkey was discovered in 2013 after following the route of a thermal spring. The site matches closely the description of the temple to the underworld that disappeared in the 6th century. The most notable feature of this gate is that deadly vapor still is blown out of the gate. Additionally, this location was once used in ancient rituals to the gods of the underworld and still claims the lives of unfortunate birds who get too close. An archaeological dig revealed the remains of an ancient temple situated on a thermal spring, long believed to have been a gateway to hell. This well-documented temple of Pluto disappeared from record sometime around the 6th century. Amongst the distinguishing features of this particular gate are the toxic fumes that waft out from the tunnels beneath. In times of antiquity, these were often inhaled by the priests of Pluto, promptly sending them into hallucinogenic trance states. Writing at some time around the year 0 AD, the Greek philosopher Strabo claimed that any animal that passes inside meets instant death. Even now, the poisonous vapors claim the lives of birds that fly or nest too close to the ruins. Only the eunuchs of Cybele, an ancient fertility goddess, were able to enter the Hellgate without any apparent damage, the report said. With the mysterious deadly vapor and ancient rituals, the gods being transformed at this location, it's not hard to believe that the devil may just be lurking deep within the temple.